Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like ENIC. They pine for move.
Hello and welcome back to Tottenham Hotspur, the Tottenham Hotspur podcast about Tottenham Hotspur podcasts. And today I'm going to be talking about how the Spurs podosphere reacted to and processed the departure of long-time club chairman Daniel Levy. Now, when I started this pod, I never expected to have to cover a major cup win, a controversial manager sacking, and let alone Daniel Levy leaving the club all within 6 months of each other. It's been a real summer of upheaval and mild turmoil in N17. Daniel Levy is such a huge figure in the modern Tottenham Hotspur fan life that how the Spurs pods talk about and just kind of dissect his legacy, I think is going to be a really fun thing for people to listen to. So stick around. It's going to be a long pod today. I'll get a little bit of business out the way early. If you like what you hear, drop me a like or a comment on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me online, share me with your friends. I've seen some great growth this month and I'd love to keep that going. Daniel Levy, what a figure, the way that he has dominated the conversation at Tottenham Hotspur for many, many years. I was thinking back on trying to sort of work out when he became a central figure and central target of ire of Spurs fans. And I don't think it's been the entire time that ENIC has been in charge, which was in 2000, 2001, depending on when you want to trace their sort of control back to. They bought a stake in the club in 2000 and took, I think, full ownership in 2001. I want to say, around the 2010s, just before Poch came in especially, I feel like Spurs fans were really starting to get antsy and annoyed at ENIC then. There had been enough close success and near misses for people to get really pissed off. So the news dropped, 10 days ago, I want to say. I'm recording this on the 14th of September. Needed a bit of time to process 20-odd podcasts, It takes a bit of listening time and a bit of thinking time. I had to put some computational power into it. And there was a lot of pods, fair play to all of those YouTube channels and podcasters who got out podcasts early on the day that the news dropped. I think Tel Cockerel got in there early. Jack to Trunk, he got in there super early too with a live stream podcast. Fair play to the Fighting Cock for getting a sort of fully recorded and edited podcast out early with gut reactions. There's been some tremendous podcast titles that have come out. Big credit to The Game Is About Glory for When the Levee Breaks, named for the famous Led Zeppelin song. And I really enjoyed Filthy Shambles titled Dear Mrs. Lewis, which, Spooky got his start as a blogger, and he has a great story about the start of the Dear Mr. Levy blog. Go check out that either on the Fighting Cock or on the Filthy Shambles. But pivoting it from Dear Mr. Levy to Viv Lewis, I think was a masterstroke. And just a quick mini Filthy Shambles mini review, I suppose. Really enjoy it. I wish he recorded more often, but what I really respect and like about Spooky is that he only wants to get behind the microphone when he feels like he has something to say and he feels like he has something to contribute. I enjoy that a lot. I like his very methodical and holistic view of Tottenham Hotspur. He doesn't necessarily get too tied up in the weeds in one thing or another. He looks at many different, things in the spider web of Spurs, and I enjoy that a lot. Go give your support to Spooky. He seems like a good dude. All right, back to business. Trying to compose how to structure this podcast, I realize that maybe there are some newer listeners who aren't super aware of the growth of the Premier League in sort of real terms, right? You hear this news all the time, or you hear this comparison all the time that the business has grown so much, but you can't quite comprehend how regional football club ownership was in the early 2000s and the late 90s when Levy, ENIC, the Lewises, Tavistock, all of that got involved in Tottenham Hotspur. We were owned by Alan Sugar, who is a lifelong Spurs fan, a controversial figure, so safe to say. He was an exhausting figure for Spurs fans, in my opinion, in the 1990s. No doubt he had the best intentions for the club, taking over from Scholar, who had left us in a bit of a state. But Alan Sugar presided over many controversies involving players, involving managers. He was very much a in-your-face personality. He was in the back pages of the news. Spurs were, despite their sort of mid-table mediocrity that we slipped into, we were still a big draw and a big story. And we had this huge, exhausting personality at the sort of center of it all. So, when Levy came in, it did feel like a bit of a change. It did feel like a change, I think, for the better. I was young, when they took over. I was like 14 or 15. So like not super tapped into everything. But there did seem to be a sort of sense of positive change in ENIC and Levy and Lewis coming in. The club was in an interesting place. We drifted for many years. Go read Gareth Dace's book on the Spurs in the 1990s if you're interested to sort of see the change in Spurs from a sort of huge club in the 1980s drifting into, I guess the closest analogous state would be Everton or maybe West Ham at a push. Big historical club that has languished and kind of rotted a little bit. So sort of football club ownership was very regional. Peter Ridsdale up in Leeds. Ken Bates was the chairman of Chelsea. Not necessarily the money guy, but he was the sort of front man for the Chelsea operation. And Daniel Levy came in, and I guess we were lucky that, again, claims to be a boyhood Spurs fan. We'll get into that later. Danny Kelly on The View from the Lane called them carpet salesmen, many of these football club owners. And that's because the sort of scale of the business at the time was a bit of a passion project for the local area. Like maybe there was some money to be made, but very much these were like lost leaders. You had people coming in and throwing money at their club because they loved it and they wanted to win the league. And we saw this with Blackburn back in the mid-90s. Won the Premier League. So, the business itself was very regional. The interest and the scale of the operations was also very regional. We weren't seeing the growth of the Premier League as a product just yet. Levy came in just as broadcasting deals were changing and the global interest in the product was primed in the next decade or so to go global. So the business operations has changed tremendously. So like the skill set that Levy came in with and was needed of a football chairman 25 years ago is, I would say, vastly different to what they need now, right? And we see that in terms of the structures of the board that's being put in place now versus kind of the one-man operation that we were for a very long time. So when the news dropped, a lot of podcasters, like I said, put out immediate pods, but people reflected upon kind of where they were when they heard the news, which is a very funny thing for football fans to do about a person that many of them have never met. It's almost like where were you when Princess Diana died kind of situation. The journalists focused on how much of an imposition it was because the news dropped at sort of roughly the end of the business day. There was people talking about having closed their laptops, ready to go home. And I always find it interesting when big news happens and the journalists talk about it, because it is such a, it's such an imposition and such a pain in the ass for them to have to change their evening plans and go back to the office and have to pump out a couple thousand words on Daniel Levy. Some gut reactions from people I did enjoy on the Fighting Cock. John Bass talking about a sense of dread that he had. It felt, weird, in the words of Flav and Cal. It was strange. This was, for better or for worse, Daniel Levy was a constant in our lives for 25 years. It didn't seem like he was going to go anywhere. There are some people on the other side of the fence. Alex from Bristol on the Fighting Cock was over the moon. I haven't heard a person that happy in a long time about football. He likened it to having scored a goal. Ben and Sim on WeAreTottenhamTV called it 24 years of tyranny now over. And that's just, I think that sums up the kind of the two major themes that came out of this. It feels like a break from the norm, a huge change, and who knows what comes next. But there's a vocal minority of very, very, very happy people. I will give credit to So Spurs. One of the co-hosts opened with thanks to Daniel Levy, and I think that's important to recognise not only what a sort of derided figure he was, but there was also some good custodian work that he did for our football club. And I want to talk about that real briefly. Sadly, it's briefly. Just from how people are packaging and presenting Daniel Levy. I want to talk about his positive legacy. And the first words out of most people's lips when they talk about Daniel Levy's positive legacy is the stadium, is the work and the effort and the energy and money that ENIC siphoned and funneled and put into, from bank loans and whatever, into regenerating the sort of Tottenham area. Regenerating is a controversial word, and I apologise to anybody who lives around Tottenham for sort of talking about the area in those terms, but it is totally transformed. Again, you can talk about whether it was a wholly better change, but it is a much more tourist-friendly area now, at the very least. The training ground was another topic which was brought up frequently. I forget what it's called now, whether it's Hotspur Way or the Spurs Lodge. It's had a variety of different names over the years. But Richard Cracknell on Last Word on Spurs, Windy on the Extra Inch, contrasted our infrastructure that Levy has overseen and what a powerful infrastructural sort of, not genius, but leader he has been, and compared us to what we had under Irving Scholar and Alan Sugar, where there was talk, and again this comes up in Gareth's book, about Spurs players needing to have, I think, gym memberships to go and exercise and work out at a local gym because we didn't have any in-house facilities. You know, this is the before ENIC time. Alan Sugar made some changes, I believe. You know, property is kind of one of his interests, I suppose. But now we're this huge infrastructural giant, I suppose. You know, we're winning awards for the things we've done. So this has been the sort of main legacy that people point to with Daniel Levy. And I agree with them. The changes are huge. I miss the old White Hart Lane. I miss the seats. I miss the roof. You know, I miss the way you see the field as you come up the steps and it starts to creep out and that beautiful green pops out. Don't miss the toilets. Those things I don't miss. And yeah, it's been a big change. Some people pointed to his community work, which is important to remember. The Spurs Show talked about the Tottenham Hotspur Foundation, the Trust, the Tottenham Hotspur Academy. So I believe that this would be the sort of sixth form college for local students to go and study at. But so all great things, investment in the local community, all these things are cheap wins, right? In the grand scheme of football finances, a little bit of, you know, good community work that looks good in some photographs you can pop up on Instagram or on your website or point to with your local council. But at the end of the day, as the Spurs Show pointed out, it's all about business. You know, these things are all somehow currying favour with the local council to get through development plans, stuff like that. Graham on Tottenham Home and Away pointed to the Supporters Club's initiative, which ENIC and Daniel Levy oversaw. Again, the sort of massive change in global interest in the Premier League product, and Spurs have capitalised on that well. And I can tell you from being on the other side of the Supporters Club programme, I run a Supporters Club, They are wonderful outreach tools, but we do a lot of free work for the club. So again, you can point to it being a good thing, but it is all about, supporting and promoting more business for the football club. Sustained success and club value is another talking point. Stu on So Spurs is, pointing out that this is one of our most successful periods in our history, just devoid of cup wins. People like to ignore the near misses and write them off. Ignore the semi-finals, ignore the finals, because we didn't get it over the line. But if you take it in its totality, it has been a very I've got to pick my words carefully. It has been a very, it's not successful. It's been an enjoyable period from a week-to-week basis for the club. We just haven't had those massive shot in the arms of adrenaline and dopamine that cup wins give us. I'll also point you to Profspur and his excellent newsletter for looking at the period of trophies and wins, etc., before and after ENIC took over. It's funny because his positive legacy, you'd think him going out with a Europa League win in his back pocket would be enough, right? As he didn't get the majority of the wins that we maybe could have, but in the end, his club structure, through hook or by crook, delivered a major European trophy. And I thought it was interesting that wasn't enough of, to use a phrase from Seb on the Cheese Room, enough of a mic drop before he left. Seb suggested he needed a huge signing as a mic drop. And I think that, again, speaks to how people view Daniel Levy as a businessman. And we'll get into the perception of him in terms of successes and where they came from later. But yeah, overall, a mostly positive period of, change at Spurs that Levy oversaw. Perhaps probably took a little bit longer than we would have liked. Maybe if this had been 5 or 10 years quicker to get to the point of a European trophy and a new stadium and all that type of stuff, people would be a lot happier. 25 years is a long time. And people grow contemptuous the longer, you spend with somebody who's doing some stuff you don't like and you can't control. All right, so failures. Let's move on to his failures. And my goodness, there were so many lists of failures that were read out across multiple pods. Martin Jol being sacked at halftime, many years ago. This came up a lot. Failures to get good PR and communications from the club came up again. But the sort of major theme that came out was transfers, and people really focused on these. And I think one of the reasons why this was concentrated on is because it's, as a Spurs fan, transfers are one of the sort of few joys aside from wins that we can sort of count on to a certain extent, right? We're not getting cup wins, we're not winning leagues, but maybe every now and then, we get that. You get that joy from a surprise signing, or we want that, we crave that. It's something that should be achievable for us, but just always feels slightly out of reach. I thought it was interesting how any successes that we've had in terms of transfers or managerial changes, as pointed out by the Spurs Show and An Echo of Glory, their successes are sort of portrayed almost as luck or other people's good work. So like the Van Gaal versus Poch, sliding doors moment. Harry Kane exploding and becoming a great player. Like, these are things that happened under Levy, but he isn't given credit for because they're seen as the result of his deficiencies or other people succeeding in spite of him. And in fact, similar to the sentiment, there's this sort of suggestion that we got so close to success but couldn't get it over the line because of his various oversights in terms of transfers and not setting the squad up for success. Some people did push back generally on this type of sentiment. Jeremy, who was a guest on Tottenham Home and Away, talked about how the losses aren't his fault. He didn't go in and choose the team. But others feel, like Lee McQueen on Last Word on Spurs, that he is just too risk averse. Daniel Levy. He doesn't want to take that big leap on signing a player in case it's a waste of money, it feels like. And a phrase that I heard this week was, penny wise, pound foolish. And this has been sort of bouncing around my mind for a while. It was echoed by somebody on Blue Sky this week, but that's certainly true, I think, right? He doesn't take that risk on spending the big money on the player we could definitely benefit from. Instead takes a different type of risk on a cheaper player who might pay off later. All those transfer near misses have been discussed. Bren on the Cheese Room talked about Grealish in Aston Villa, and we all heard the stories about nickel and diming Villa for Grealish, offering lower money, offering, I think, Josh Onomar. And then while he was negotiating, Villa got taken over and didn't need our money anymore. Somebody mentioned Rivaldo, who I didn't realise would have overlapped with Levy's tenure. And of course, this year we had two huge near misses in Morgan Gibbs-White and Eberechi Eze. Kind of publicly embarrassing us. And I talked about that on the last pod, so I don't want to talk about that again. There's a sense that we haven't had a huge signing since Jurgen Klinsmann, which was voiced by Ricky on Last Word on Spurs. And I thought this was also kind of interesting. There were suggestions that maybe somebody like Rafa van der Vaart might have been close to that kind of level. But it's potentially true. And it does put the whole period of time from Alan Sugar making that signing in 1994 all the way to today, that has there been a similar sort of earth-moving signing made by Tottenham Hotspur in that period? Potentially not, sadly. Maybe that'll change, who knows? But it's hard to make those signings, though, when you aren't the sort of Liverpool or Chelsea or Man City or Man United of this world. We should be that, but we're not. And again, more on that later. I did enjoy that Paul O'Keefe, who sometimes is somewhat maligned in sort of online circles, but he was on Last Word on Spurs reacting to the news. And he did push back on some of the suggestions that Levy wasn't involved in negotiations this summer, which I thought was interesting, because when I heard that the news of him leaving dropped, my assumption was potentially that he'd been sidelined all summer. But it kind of makes sense in retrospect that he and his sort of negotiation prowess would be involved, and it would be foolish to think that people wouldn't recognize a change in our negotiation style for the most important person at the club to not be involved this summer. Yeah, and just coming back to some of these transfers. Dan on Filthy Shambles points out that we're going to find out if his risk aversion, which I referenced earlier, was the right choice. We're seeing now some of the levers that clubs like Barcelona or other Premier League teams wield to sort of stimulate cash flow in terms of loaning against future earnings. We've just seen that come out at the start of the month. We're going to see if Daniel Levy's sort of dislike for these types of strategies were the right choice for our football club. Whether choosing consistent stability over buying a lottery ticket was the right choice. Another thing that people disliked about Levy was his sort of flip-flopping, where I think is the phrase that I heard a lot, of managerial styles and changing managers. The Game is About Glory, Jack Pitbrook on View from the Lane pointed this out, and they felt like it just wasn't conducive to a long-term strategy. And again, this sort of comes back to where Levy was as a chairman 25 years ago, when you possibly did see this sort of whiplashing between managerial styles, when you were looking for the person who was kind of, it was a very old school method, but you'd have your manager as the central sort of footballing figure at your club rather than a director of football or somebody else, in favor of a more sort of what was termed many years ago a sort of more European model of having a director of football with a long-term football strategy and managers coming in to execute that vision who would fit and align with the players you already had. But there's a sense that Daniel Levy's failure to have a consistent footballing identity at the club beyond, things that he can paste up on a wall to dare us to do, etc. His failure to have that meant that we wasted money on players potentially, and it just hasn't been good for growth of the football club. And like in theory, when it works, great. I mean, look at Chelsea, right? They've flip-flopped between managers constantly over the last 25, 30 years. But when it doesn't, it can be really, really bad. And yeah, it was just a sense that he got lucky with Poch. He wanted Van Gaal, couldn't get Van Gaal, went to a second choice. But there was a sense that everything after sort of Harry Redknapp, so between Redknapp and Poch, were not great choices. We had Tim Sherwood in there. We had Andre Villas-Boas. It just wasn't. It wasn't a sort of thoughtful period of growth at that time for our managerial choices, and this was voiced by an echo of glory. But for me, I think the sort of biggest failure of Daniel Levy was his longevity, quite frankly. I was doing some reading about this, and I was looking into the sort of average time that a chairperson or a CEO or somebody spends at the board level in an English company. And the UK Corporate Governance Code specifies a sort of recommended 9-year limit on the tenure for a chair at a club or at a company. And this is because the sort of longer that somebody's there, they stagnate. This was said by Spooky on, I think, Filthy Shambles. They can get left behind by the size of the industry, as said by Alex on The Fighting Cock. They can surround themselves with sycophants and yes men, and there's kind of a hive mind, there's tunnel vision, whatever. There's just a lack of diversity of thought in the boardroom. So the average sort of period of time that I saw that chair people or CEOs seem to spend at companies is actually sort of closer to 5 across all businesses. I don't know how true that is. You can blame Google, Gemini, or whatever their search engine AI is. I did some looking around, at people like whoever's been in charge at Arsenal. I think they've had 3 chairman or chairman equivalents in the same period of time as we've had 1. Chelsea have had 5. Liverpool, I think, 3. The closest that I saw was Bill Kenwright at Everton, who was, long-term, again, comes from that old school regional sort of supporter, titan of industry type of person who dominated the boardrooms back in the 1990s and the 2000s. And of course, the worst thing about being in charge for a long period of time is your skill set is one thing, but the landscape changes. And what we've seen in football in the last 20 years and across many industries, don't get me wrong, it's been changing massively. Nathan A. Clark on The Extra Inch talking about how Daniel Levy had a lot of positives about him, but the landscape changed by the money and financial doping of Manchester City and Chelsea. And Levy and ENIC failed to recognize these changes, I think, and they failed to keep up. Jack on The View from the Lane pointed out how people just get fed up, and I talked about that a bit earlier. I guess it's a bit like a stagnant marriage, right? Everyone, if you were happy and you're spending more and more time together and getting more and more miserable. And there's a lot of complaining that's been happening in the fan base. And I think that once that narrative takes hold, it's hard to get out of it without massive cup successes. And I think maybe Levy saw the writing on the wall when his tenure finally yielded a major trophy. And he got booed at the stadium, got booed at the parade, This poor guy, he's just trying to do what he thinks is right for the club, and he's getting booed after we win something that he oversaw. It's crazy. Changes in style. Spurs Show talked about how the bullying manager archetype is gone. You know, like Alex Ferguson's hairdryer shouting at players, that's gone. And maybe this difficult to work with negotiating style that we've heard about Daniel Levy over the years has gone too. This has come out of people like WeAreTottenhamTV, Lee McQueen, Theo Delaney, just talking about how Levy has tried to really wring out success for Spurs and in negotiations in every transfer, dealing with other clubs, and has eventually just made potentially too many enemies at other clubs and this has caught up with him. He hasn't got too many friends. He hasn't got favourable relationships he can lean on to get stuff done, and maybe that's just not how transfers occur nowadays. I mean, I don't know how much I necessarily buy into that. I think that some of this is the picture that Spurs fans have painted of Levy over the years, but I believe there is probably a truth that you get more flies with honey than with vinegar, perhaps, in negotiations, and especially such a chummy, you know, for all of its growth, football business, it still has a bit of an old boys network about it, you know, even though it's this massive multinational industries now, but there's still a little bit of, you call up somebody, you talk to them, and if you're friends, maybe you hash out a deal. And it's funny, like somebody on Dr. Tottenham pointed out how Levy has become synonymous with Spurs in a way that other chairmen kind of haven't. Again, maybe you could look at Bill Kenwright at Everton, but he's not in the news as much. Everton haven't been quite anywhere near as successful as us over the years, and certainly have copped far less grief than we have. But it's just kind of crazy how you can look at other clubs and you sort of think, okay, Liverpool, who do you think of? Well, nowadays you might think of Klopp, right? Years ago, maybe you would think of Kenny Dalglish or, you know, Bill Shankly. Manchester United, you got Sir Alex Ferguson. Arsenal, Arsene Wenger. For me, and with Chelsea, it's Mourinho is the person I think of. But with us, it's not a footballing person. It's a business person, and I think there's something very telling about the lack of success that we've had, but also the way that Spurs fans have become programmed to think is all around sort of business, and it has been for a long time. Again, I talked about Alan Sugar and being an ever-present in the news. It goes back a long way. It's not just necessarily Daniel Levy. I wouldn't say that Alan Sugar was synonymous with the club back in the 90s, but I just think that maybe that was kind of priming the club for us to start sort of obsessing over what happens in the boardroom, perhaps. The Spurs Show talked a little bit how there was an atmosphere of fear within the club. You know, there's a sense that he was such a micromanager and so across multiple facets of the club, perhaps beyond where he should have been, that, again, they were suggesting that he was the only voice that anybody had to sort of respond to and listen to. And people were scared of him. I think Theo Delaney talked about that when he went behind the scenes to video the documentary for when we left the old White Hart Lane. He just got that sense of things. And just generally, you know, Paul O'Keefe, again, mentioned how the beast just got too big for him. His successes were perhaps in some ways his own downfall. He did all this good work to build us up and build the stadium and move us into consistent European qualifiers. And again, you know, people talked about this a lot, but like back in the 90s, it was a pipe dream to be regular UEFA Cup, a regular UEFA Cup team, let alone Champions League, which is what our expectation is now. And Nathan on the Extra Inch talks about how Levy's successes were also adapted elsewhere. Again, you know, kind of a victim of his own success. He did some stuff in his own way that other clubs have looked at and said, yeah, we're going to do that too. And you see this now with trying to turn stadia into kind of multi-purpose entertainment venues and hubs. The plans that Manchester United have put through, what Everton have built with their stadium. They're looking at what Levy has conceptualized that we could do with the Tottenham Hotspur, you know, club area, the stadium area, and the money generation outside of match days, stuff like that, as something that they want to do too. But when you're the first one to do it, great. You need to capitalize upon that. Unfortunately, what you do if you don't capitalize is other people steal from you, steal your ideas, and catch up. And just one thing I want to touch on before I move on to Levy as a person was a concept that Stephen, who was a guest on the Tottenham Home and Away podcast, voiced, which was that he feels particularly aggrieved towards Levy because he feels that he created the environment for us to be tagged as Spursy. And this is just something I want to just really drill down on as briefly as I can, but I want to do it justice where possible. I guess the idea here is that the successes and the near misses are Levy's fault. He's created a lost culture at the club. We're happy with top 4, but not motivated enough for, cup wins. That isn't why we exist. This, I guess, would be the suggestion. We're a consistent money generator through top 4 finishes, not through cup wins. A few people pointed to him giving watches to the players for the Champions League final, for example. And just generally, the Spursy tag is kind of a controversial one. It didn't exist before Levy. Of course, whether that was convergent evolution. ESPN thinks it can trace back to a Fighting Cock forum in 2013 to refer to lightweight players with class, but who can't stomach a, wet night in Stoke. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting concept. I don't necessarily want to blame. I'm not sure what I want to say here. Some of it's meme culture, right? Like, you can look at it and say, well, Daniel Levy created the environment for Spursy, but around the same time, 2014, 2013, you're talking about a massive change in how ideas and concepts spread and are generated across the internet. And this is really what Spursy is. It was an internet phenomenon that made it into real life. Whether or not Daniel Levy could have done more to stop it, as an Echo of Glory felt particularly pissed off about. They said that Spurs fans bore the brunt of this kind of tag. But again, maybe he could have done more by not signing Saha and Nelson. Maybe he could have maybe could have put some more money into that Poch team that we all adored. I don't know. But there's something in it. I think there's a grain of truth in this idea that Levy is indirectly responsible for the Spursy tag. Let me know what you think. What about him as a person, though? If we move away from kind of the things he did in a business sense, what about how podcasters were relaying stories of Daniel Levy? Well, there was some sort of 3 big areas I want to talk about. Him as a Spurs fan, his kind of human side, and him as a boss. Dan Kilpatrick on View from the Lane shared a story of a contact of his who has some insider knowledge of the club. Dan is a former journalist, now editor at The Athletic. How Levy lacks an understanding of cultural progress and the importance of the things that fans value. Communication, messaging, explaining yourself. All of it comes down to communication at the end of the day. A few more cup wins. Whereas Daniel Levy's sort of perspective of Spurs and what is considered successes is the business side of things, is turning us into a self-sustaining business. And I guess he's been successful in that regard. Danny Kelly pointed out how Levy, as not understanding this kind of cultural side of the game, he apologized to the NFL before Spurs fans about the building delays that we saw when we were moving out of the old White Hart Lane and into the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And again, this is this communication thing. Again, it's kind of like a marriage between Spurs fans and Daniel Levy. We're yelling at him, he's not talking to us. There's this mutual antagonism going on. The Spurs Show had a lot of anecdotes about Daniel Levy and him as a person. I've heard people having dinner with him, or sharing stories of meeting him, etc., etc. Go check out one of their podcasts. I forget which one, but it would have been almost immediately after Levy was fired or released. They were talking about how he isn't a fan like us. Somebody was talking about how Daniel Levy was asked his favourite player, and he answered Gary Lineker. And this was derided. And, while it isn't the choice I'd make, isn't that kind of the nature of fandom? Is some of it is odd. You can't quite put your finger on why you like somebody. It could be a personality thing. It could be because he scored goals. My favourite player is Jermaine Defoe, and people tell me that they hate Jermaine Defoe. This is just kind of the nature of fandom. And again, with Daniel Levy, whenever anything he does is expressed, when he sort of shows anything of himself, we jump all over him. We tell him that it's bad, and I think some of it is just because we've decided that he's bad. So therefore, anything he does, or anything he likes, or any ideas he has, or sort of plans he has for Tottenham, must also be bad. In his humanity, there's a Frank Lampard style transition for you there, but in his humanity, the Spurs Show talks about again how he lacks charisma. He doesn't treat people right. Mike has a lot of stories about this. People talked about the furlough during COVID, Martin Jol getting sacked at half time, and again, on this, an Echo of Glory talked about it wasn't just necessarily that Levy made bad decisions in their in their opinion. It was about how they were done that made them worse. Alistair Gold talks about how Daniel Levy had zero interest in talking to journalists, which again is kind of mind-blowing. He's been there 25 years. Alistair Gold's been covering Spurs for a long time, and Daniel Levy isn't pressing the flesh and buttering up these people who are out there presenting his product week on week. It's kind of mind-blowing if true. I've got no reason to believe it isn't. And yeah, I talked already about the lack of comms, that this was a frequent discussion. Symptom of Daniel Levy not valuing the sort of the people side of things. And I'm just going to double tap on something that N17 Women shared, which is that Daniel Levy at times came across as dismissive of the women's team. I can't speak to this in my own experience, haven't been following them for long enough, but I wanted to give some time to sharing that opinion of Levy. And again, maybe that's a business decision. It's kind of an easy win, but why even have a women's team if you're not gonna invest and grow them? It's just there's a product and there's a team that people adore that you have control over, and it just seems like it's an afterthought. Again, it speaks to the strangeness of Daniel Levy and his thought processes at times, or at the very least the structure he put in place at the club. And finally, he was a micromanager from what we can tell. Multiple pods talked about how he was involved in everything at Tottenham Hotspur. He caused bottlenecks. He had restricted thinking, supposedly. And generally, he was distracted by his legacy, by the stadium. The flip side of this, we had a micromanager before. I don't think anybody likes working for a micromanager. And again, maybe this comes back to how we construct this image of Daniel Levy. We've not met the guy. We've only seen snippets of him here and there, but we hear these stories about him as a micromanager, as a kind of, we've all worked with somebody who just can't let other people do their thing, and they're not fun to work with. We don't like those people, and I think that filters into us constructing our worldview of him. Some pods did suggest, though, that there are some benefits to having just one singular person that you have to convince of a plan, and that we might see some growing pains moving forward as ideas and concepts for the club now will need approvals across multiple departments. But again, this is probably a good thing in the long run, but it might slow stuff down. So the fans, there was a lot of stuff around Daniel Levy that were directly targeted at fans that pissed them off, right? You got ticket prices, you got the move to Stratford, the Super League, right? All these things, again, break down this relationship between Daniel Levy and the fans. Giving some space to a topic that I've discussed before in this pod, which is change for Tottenham. They came up multiple places. Last Word on Spurs, Fighting Cock, obviously Hometown Glory, all talked about the sort of fan pressure and work of Change for Tottenham. And we don't have to get into it here, but generally speaking, I think that fan voices are a good thing. I think some of the way they've done things are not perfect. Nobody's perfect. Some of their messaging is not ideal for the sort of scale of the work that they're trying to take on. And let's just hope that they get better at it. Billy T, who was a key figure in the Change for Tottenham movement, appeared on multiple pods. He was very keen to downplay their role. There's kind of a weird vibe in certain spaces around Change for Tottenham. Like in some messaging, it seems like they're implying an involvement. They're not necessarily actively distancing themselves from the decision the club's been making, but they're also going on and trying to downplay their role in other spaces. So they're a little bit inconsistent. Billy did speculate that it wasn't necessarily Change for Tottenham that was the downfall of Daniel Levy, but so much as the media attention. Perhaps the product turned toxic, and that was the decision to get rid of him. I don't know. And as part of that, Nick on So Spurs talked about how our value as a football club, as an entity, we're not just a business making, the best quality tires or roofs or whatever, right? A big part of our business is fan sentiment and fan goodwill. And we have just clearly got to the point, and again, showcased by the boos during the parade, where the fan goodwill for the club was at an all-time low, despite the greatest success in 25 years, 30, 40 years, potentially. Jason, on Last Word on Spurs, felt that Change for Tottenham made the sponsors jittery. And again, maybe this is true. We'll never know. I don't think it was a good look. But I also don't know if some of these sponsors really care. It wasn't like it wasn't like it was empty stadia, There was still money being made. And just, sort of counterpoint to all this, Spooky, talking on the Fighting Cock, talked about how Change for Tottenham have now lost a scapegoat. And again, I talked about this earlier, how much of a sort of central figure Daniel Levy has become at Spurs and within Spurs fans' minds. He was on the signs, the posters, the T-shirts, whatever the Change for Tottenham and various fan groups over the years have been have created. We'll see whether that moves on to Vinay Venkatesham or Viv Lewis or ENIC in general. We'll see. Spooky did say social media will find a new scapegoat. We'll see. Things are good right now for Tottenham, right? This is an interesting time for Levy to go, because Spurs are, cruising on a bit of a high from winning a trophy. Thomas Frank has come in and has thankfully hit the ground running. We've made some decent signings at the end of the window. It's not like he's leaving and we're like languishing, and like if he'd left last year when we were getting on to 17th, right? Like, generally speaking, the vibes are more positive than negative. Speaking of fans, so if we just sort of turn out and reflect outwardly for a moment, I want to call out something that Cal said on the Fighting Cock. There's that other fans, so fans of other football clubs, might see this as a win for them. They respect Daniel Levy. They respect the work he's done. They respect how much he's built up Tottenham from where we were in 2000, 2001 to where we are today, to the scale of our business, to the ability to generate revenue from the stadium. All these things. There's a begrudging respect was the word he used, whilst also considering that we have somewhat stagnated recently. An Echo of Glory felt that other fans must be jealous of how well run we have been over the period of time. And if you look back to, I think it was January 1st, 2000, Leeds were top of the Premier League, and then shortly afterwards collapsed, went down at least one league within the English football system came back up and are just a shadow of them form themselves. And in the same period of time, Tottenham have just sort of gone on an upward trajectory. Like if you look at other clubs around us in the same period of time, we've had a pretty good time. So other fans, perhaps see this as a good thing. We'll only find out in time. And I guess I should talk about the hatred and unacceptable toxic behavior directed towards Daniel Levy briefly. And I didn't hear enough of this in the podcasts that I listened to. ASD on Echoes of Glory, Alistair Gold talked about it. Daniel Levy has been the subject of death threats, which are unacceptable. There was talk, I forget who said it, that his children have a security detail. Somebody else said Daniel Levy can't come back to the stadium. Again, forgive me for forgetting who said these things. A few fans made light of a joke that was made on X recently about somebody having 2 bullets, and if they were in a room with Daniel Levy and somebody much, much worse, they would shoot Daniel Levy twice. And you can chalk this up to being a joke, but there are certain things which, like, what's the joke here? That you would, you hate him that much that you'd shoot him? I mean, I'm not an unfunny person, but it's not something you joke about, in my opinion. And the reason that they were talking about this tweet is because the person who posted it, I believe, was suspended from using X. Anyway, Daniel Levy has received an unacceptable level of hatred relative to the kind of inadequacies that he's shown as a chairman at times. So what's next? What's coming next? We've got ENIC and the Lewis family. There's been a lot of speculation on whether a sale is imminent, and all of this is guesswork, so I don't really want to get into it here. If in, a month's time, knowing my luck, we probably will. If in, a month's time, we've sold up and we've been taken over by, the bloke who owns Tesco's or, somebody who's a Powerball winner, then I'll talk about the ethics and all that stuff of new owners then. At the moment, it's all guesswork. It's people working on vibes. At the moment, as things are, state of play, we've got the same general ownership model, but with a slightly different structure underneath. There's been a lot of talk about what the corporate consultancy group who came in and evaluated the club, what they made of us and what was going on. Go listen to the lab if you're interested in that type of thing. But generally speaking, I think in terms of investment, like, where's the money going to come from? Milo and Steph on the Game is About Glory suggesting that just nothing's going to change meaningfully or drastically overnight. There was been suggestions that ENIC might want to do something that Levy was incapable of doing, whether that was because of his own sort of worldview or his skill set or his sort of way that he conducts business. But this was voiced by Paul O'Keefe, Alex on the Fighting Cock, and I mean, that's possible, right? The money might stay roughly the same, but perhaps we're going to do things slightly differently, maybe. Dan Kilpatrick on View from the Lane felt maybe they're making the club more appealing for a sale. And again, maybe there will be some investment that comes. You're probably more valuable if you've won some more trophies, if you've got some more valuable assets in the players. It's unlikely, though, like, that the Lewises have disliked something he's done in terms of his business practices. He's been in charge for too long. This was, again, Nick on So Spurs mentioned this. So it comes back to this idea that it's more of the same that's coming, not a huge gear shift necessarily. Viv Lewis, who seems to be taking a much more prominent role. We saw her in the stands alongside Vinay Venkatesham at the West Ham game this weekend. Spurs Show said she's believed to be a big Spurs fan. This is good. I mean, I prefer that. I prefer to have somebody who has some affection for us than somebody who comes in and sees us purely as an asset to use. But that's because I'm old-fashioned, I want to think that the person who owns and controls the thing that I love has also some affection for it. And that was something that I liked about Daniel Levy, was how he was said to be a Spurs fan. Richard Cracknell on Last Word on Spurs is worried about some family infighting. There's just been so many references to Succession, a show that I haven't watched across these podcasts, but that seems to be on the forefront of people's minds. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the kind of C-suite level activities that might be, changing or being put in place at Tottenham, go check out Dr. Tottenham's pod about Levy going. Sam there seems to be quite knowledgeable. His opinion was that this is a de facto new ownership group that wants to be known and wants to be seen. The reasons for that are unknown to us right now, but it's remarkable to point that out. And again, go look at the lab interview. Vinay Venkatesham, interesting guy, seems like a nice bloke. I like him. He put out a comms video pretty quickly to talk about the changes with Levy going, but also there was some swift publications of press statements about bids from investment groups, Amanda Staveley, etc. And this is all talking, sort of loosely here, an example of seizing a narrative which we haven't seen under Levy's ownership, and perhaps this is the benefit of having multiple specialists, all with somewhat similar power levels within a power levels like they're like a fucking Dragon Ball Z character, all with similar sort of levels of power within an organization, who some of them are media people, some of them are legal people, some of them are financial people, whereas Daniel Levy was over too much and spread too thin with a general skill set. And they've seen an opportunity here to take hold of some of the good fan sentiment. And this is something that I noticed, is that fans seem to be somewhat behind Venkatesham and the new ENIC de facto new leadership group. Lauren on Hometown Glory and Rosa talked about how this is all something that Levy should have been doing, really remarked on the speed at which some of these statements and videos were produced, anticipating the fans' need. I think people value that and they seem to enjoy it. Again, Vinay Venkatesham seems to be the anti-Levy at the moment. People like Barnaby on Spurred On talking about how they trust him. This is all stuff that just wasn't there, and I think that this is refreshing. I enjoy it. I think trust is a huge deal in football. And the more I think about how podcasters talk, a lot of their worries come down to trust. Counterpoint, though, shout out to the boys on Tottenham Boys Making All the Noise for expressing concern about hiring Vinay Venkatesham. They don't like it. They don't like that he's got, Arsenal experience, that he's come over from them. They felt that as a cultural thing for Spurs, it's important that we don't sign players, we don't bring over staff or managers. We saw this with George Graham, the man in the raincoat. That we don't invest our resources into supporting people who've previously worked at Arsenal. So they don't like Vinay Venkatesham. So, I didn't hear that beyond their podcast, but I enjoyed the debate and the thought process that it provoked in me. I personally don't care in the C-suite. I don't think they're fans of the club, and I don't think they're fans of football in the same way that footballers are. I care more about somebody who's out there representing us in our shirt than I do about somebody in the boardroom who, at the end of the day, is most motivated by a profit margin. But each to their own, and I think it's important to have these conversations across the fan base. Vinay Venkatesham, again, in terms of trust, he's been building that up not only with the fans but with the journalists. Alasdair Gold talked about how he's friendly to journalists when they come to the media room or they're on match days, getting their I think they get sandwiches or food or something for free when they're covering the club. N17 Women, Andrew on the Tottenham Depot have talked about how, generally speaking, Vinay Venkatesham seems to be positive about Spurs women. He was present at their home opener. Again, this is this important, simple stuff that you can do to not lose the trust from fans immediately after taking a more visible role within the organisation. Majestic on Inside Spurs seems to like how they're more transparent. But, let's not overtrust. We're very eager to love, I would think, Spurs fans. And we were so ready to embrace a new ownership structure that isn't Levy, Spooky, Skipjack on Blue Sky, talking about let's express some caution, pump the brakes a little bit, and not just sort of go full tilt. Let's see what the things that are done by this new leadership group are before we sort of really give them benefit of the doubt. But right now it does seem like there is a goodwill between the fan base and the new ownership group, which is refreshing and a bit of a relief, quite frankly. Ticket prices aren't going to change. I'm skeptical if the money's going to be spent that differently. Barnaby on Spurred On, the same. Finally, just before I wrap things up, I just want to touch base real quickly on the concept of a good billionaire. And this came up in multiple places. The Fighting Cock spent a lot of time talking about it. The sort of general consensus has been that no, there is no such thing as a good billionaire. They all want more power. They want more money. Spooky on Filthy Shambles spent a long time chatting with Dan about this, how there's no good owners. And I think that really it's personal choice about what you do next in terms of if we get sold, who might take over. Again, we'll cross this bridge if a sale comes, and I'm still podding. It is an escape. Spooky talked about this. Football should be fun. Some people do just want to view what happens on the field and not think about the other stuff, not worry about human rights violations or, people working in factories under subhuman conditions. Like they want to put those things out of their mind. And I think that's totally legitimate. On the other side of things, you got the people, and I know some people personally who will walk away from the club if certain owners take over. And I think that people should be able to find where they feel most comfortable about this thing that's a huge part of their lives. If an ownership group comes in that's, not palatable, let's say, to be nice about it, I think there are ways to still embrace your love of the club, but you just don't give them money directly. You can go watch a game at the pub. You can stream it online. You don't have to buy a shirt. You don't have to buy club merch. And that's something that you love that's been taken away from you. But if you do care about who comes in and takes over the club, there are ways for you to protest that and make yourself feel personally comfortable, because that's all you can do at the end of the day. But there's all of this discussion about good billionaires and sort of almost like ranking them in terms of tier lists, like is having slaves worse than, running sweatshops, that type of thing. It just kind of all reminded me of the Good Place point system, if anybody's watched that show, where the concept of morality has been so skewed by modern life that nobody can get into heaven, everyone goes to hell. And that's kind of how I feel about this billionaire chat. So in conclusion, how should we remember Daniel Levy? It's hard to say because it's so fresh, right? It's 2 weeks. Only time will tell. A phrase that came up frequently in these podcasts was seismic, however. This is one of those crossing the Rubicon moments that really is huge. It's generational. Flav on the Fighting Cock talked about how he was one of the most important figures in our history in terms of progressing the club. We are going to be losing somebody who has standing in the game, in the business side of things. Maybe he lost some enemies, but his experience and I think the respect he probably commands in the Premier League sort of chairperson meetings is huge. That Spurs as a club are losing that power. This was raised by the guys on An Echo of Glory. I did do a rough and ready sentiment analysis on this, and I felt that the bulk of the podcasts that I listened to, and again it was in sort of 20-ish or so, they were all leaning towards positivity or were outright thinking that it was a good time for him to leave. There was nobody who was negative on it, who felt that he should have stayed longer. There was nobody who really expressed huge concerns about the new leadership structure coming in. Everything is positive about this. The timing is good. The people coming in is acceptable. Again, it sidesteps the debate about billionaires, who's coming in. It's more of what we've seen before. We've gotten used to Vinay Venkatesham. Nobody really thinks about Peter Charrington, the non-executive chairman. And we'll see. The only podcast that I felt that was truly neutral was N17 Women. And this is understandable. The women's side of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club has been neglected for so long. They're not expecting huge changes overnight that are going to be positive. This for them might just be more neglect on this level of what they've seen previously. And I think that's totally understandable and a very logical way to respond to this news. Something that I did notice when I was listening to people talk on these podcasts is your reaction to Daniel Levy and his legacy somewhat depends on your generation. I think an Echo of Glory might have talked about this too. Older folks, no offense, those who remember the 1970s and 1980s kind of glory years, this kind of the Spurs Show crowd, are going to be leaning more towards huge favoritism for Levy going, for his impact being insufficient. They remember us picking up cup win after cup win after cup win, right? Going out and being able to, sign Ozzy Ardiles and Ricky Villa. This is what they remember. These were their formative years as football fans. And they've overseen a period of malaise followed by complacency to interpret what I hear. Younger fans, people like myself who were born in the 80s and their formative years were in the 1990s. Think of someone like Jack on the Roost and how he talks. Stu on So Spurs. That was a rough period of time to be a young Spurs fan. We had a cup win in 1991 and then a cup win in 99, and then nothing for a long period of time. And in between them, it wasn't exactly plain sailing. It wasn't like we were banging on the door and competing for the league every year. Sometimes we were finishing pretty low, nearly got relegated in 96, before Klinsmann came back and saved us. Dreaming of playing in Europe per Stu on So Spurs. But funnily enough, I do think that it comes back around for even newer fans. Think of, younger guys, US pods, American podcasts. They would have only known Daniel Levy as a derisory figure. They wouldn't have had that transition from Spurs in the 90s through to Spurs in the 2000s that maybe people in my situation would have experienced and have perhaps a bit more warmth or forgiveness towards Levy. And again, it's not universal. I'm just interpreting what I'm hearing across multiple pods. And the Cheese Room also talked about how there might be a generational divide on how people are going to perceive incoming investment. And that's something I'm going to have to keep an eye on. Who knows if this is going to change our perception? Ricky and Last Word Spurs talked about this. It's a new era. We've over-fixated on Levy for a long time. Jim on So Spurs talked about this. He's been a figure that we can project our fears onto, but funnily enough, not our hopes. I guess we've not had that trust that would be enacted, our hopes and dreams. We've saved that for our players and coaches. And some of this is natural, right? They're the people out on the field scoring the goals and stuff. Windy on the Extra Inch talked about how the in versus out debate has defined the modern Spurs fan. And Spooky talked about how some fans have lost their identity. And it's going to be interesting to see how those types of people adjust to the new reality of Tottenham Hotspur now. From my perspective, I think fans are generally conditioned to want more and more. Look at Manchester United, look at Liverpool, look at Chelsea. Like, they've been successful teams, but they still want more and more. It's even true of a club like Tottenham, who haven't had the success that we should have had. We have conditioned the fans by having to dare us to do everywhere around the football club. It gets into your head, it gets into what you want and what you want to see. I think Daniel Levy was a guy who wanted the best for Tottenham. His view of Tottenham was a little bit broader and a little bit shifted from what the average football fan wanted. But I do think deep down that he felt that providing stability to a club that lacked stability in the 1990s was important. He perhaps overvalued that 20 odd years on. His approach and public persona needed a massive overhaul, but I also respect that maybe he's just not that kind of dude. But there was a breakdown in communication and trust between the fans and with the leadership group, and I think this is a nice hard reset on that without necessarily compromising on some of the other values that we have as a fan base that would be challenged by new ownership groups coming in. Who knows? Let's see what comes next. Well, this has been a long one. I am exhausted. Thank you if you stayed all the way to the end. Keep listening to Tottenham podcasts. Keep making Tottenham podcasts, and come on, you Spurs.